Okay, hello everyone. So today what we're going to do is take a look at Illinois Part 2060, which is the law that covers all substance abuse treatment programs. It is an extensive law. You can find the entire thing online, and I do encourage you to look it up so you can see what it looks like and how it's laid out online. The slides you're going to look at today just cover a few particular details that I wanted to draw your attention to. Okay, so on this first slide, you can see that the 2060 law applies to every facility in Illinois that is licensed to provide treatment. Regardless of the level of care, they are covered under this law and they need to follow any applicable parts for their facility. In order to be licensed, in order to maintain your license, you need to follow this. In particular, there's 5 subparts which are labeled A through E. And again, if you look at the entire thing online, you will see each of those parts. And it addresses ASAM terminology. So ASAM is written right into the Illinois state law and includes those ASAM levels of care, level 1, level 2, level 3, and it can't even be a level 4 if it's a hospitalization. Here you see in section 309 that the credentials needed to work in a substance abuse treatment facility are listed. You could be simply a CADC, or you could also be a licensed professional counselor, a licensed psychologist, or a licensed social worker, and of course you could hold multiple credentials as well. If the facility is licensed to provide medically monitored care or medical detox, then somebody on staff at all times must be a registered nurse or an EMT. Registered nurse would be more common, but at the very least they would need to hold one of those credentials. The next part we're looking at here is section 323, and this addresses patient rights. Now, I won't read all the rights to you. I know you can do that, but it is important to be aware of these, and every facility should be providing these rights to clients when they're first coming in and agreeing and consenting to treatment. They should also have this posted somewhere in the facility so that any visitors, any clients, any staff are quickly aware of them and can see all of those. So you see some information about confidentiality, some particular attention paid to HIV status, and importantly, in part 1 here, it talks about services not being denied to anyone because of their race, religion, their ethnicity, their disability, sexual orientation, or HIV status. So again, it's important that all clients or patients receive this before they receive any type of treatment, and that they've read it, maybe that you go over it with them and they're familiar with all of these pieces. This next slide is fairly short. It addresses section 325 about client records. Just some real basic things to be aware of. And obviously all facilities, all programs should be maintaining a record for the client. It seems like it should go without saying, but if an auditor comes and there's not a record for each and every client, you could be in a lot of trouble. Any notes that are in there should be signed and dated, and the person who wrote the note should list his or her credentials. Now today, in the environment we're in, most facilities are moving to electronic or digital records, and those must also be protected. So they have to be either encrypted or have some type of password so that not just anybody can access those. Moving into section 401, now we're looking at the ASAM levels of care. And you should be familiar with these, but again, it's level 0.5, which is considered early intervention or risk education. Then we have level 1, which is basic outpatient treatment. And then level 2 consists of 2 types of treatment. 2.1 is intensive outpatient or IOP, and level 2.5 is partial hospitalization or level 2.5. These are still non-residential levels of care, and they would mean that the person is going home basically and has their own residence outside of the program. You can see the other levels of care on this slide. So level 3 is a residential care. So this could be a halfway house. If it was level 3.1, it could also be a residential treatment program at level 3.5 or even level 3.7, depending on the intensity needed. In these levels of care, you do tend to see staff on duty 24 hours a day, except in a halfway house that would be required. These are the programs we typically think of as 28-day programs or sometimes longer, although the length of stay should be based more on client need. But those are the kind of programs we're looking at as far as residential goes. And then, of course, the halfway houses are included there. And in level 4, we have medically managed intensive inpatient. So this is 24-hour medical care. This is doctors and nurses on staff. This would be a client who has some type of physical or medical need that would have to be addressed in more of a hospital setting before they could go into a different program. Okay, so moving into part 407, which is about group treatment, which should be familiar to everyone. There are 2 different types of groups described in the 2060. The first is didactic groups, which are just educationally focused. Sometimes we call them psychoeducational. You're teaching or informing the client group about something in these groups. They recommend that these groups average no more than 24 clients per group, although they do not specify a firm cap on that. So that's more of a guideline there, but you should keep that in mind as far as trying to keep the groups to that size. As far as counseling groups, these are more of a process or therapeutic focus and less educational in nature. These would tend to be a lot more input from individual members in the group and a lot more feedback to one another. And these do have a specific limit of no more than 16 in a group. So if you're in a treatment program, say an outpatient program where you have more than 16 clients who might show up for a group, they should have a plan in place where if 17 or 18 clients appear for group that night, you would have to split that into 2 separate groups and you'd have to have 2 different counselors running those groups. They also encourage us to include these counseling process-focused groups as part of the treatment plan, a way for clients to share different information or give feedback to one another. Section 421 of the 2060 details treatment plans, and there's different requirements for different levels of care. So the higher the intensity in the level of treatment, the more frequently a treatment plan needs to be updated. So you see if you're at that level 4, which is a hospital-based, medically managed intense program, then you have a requirement that every 24 hours somebody needs to be updating the treatment plan. So that's important to be aware of. If you're at level 2 or 3, you need to do that every 7 days. So every week, the counselor or the social worker, whoever the staff member is assigned to that client, needs to actually write an updated treatment plan addressing their progress and making sure the client signs that, of course. And then at level 1, you have a little bit more time. You have 14 days in order to put out a new treatment plan. Treatment plans do need to be signed by a physician, so it's typical that if you don't have a doctor there all the time, that somebody will come in periodically during the week a couple of times and will sign any notes that need to be signed. And probably the most important thing to be aware of is that every treatment plan should include a problem, a goal, objectives, methods, and then some kind of time frame or date in which those are to be completed. And as part of the methods, we need to talk about what type of activities the client is doing. The treatment plan is written for the client's benefit so that he or she can walk away and know exactly what activities or what kind of methods he or she is doing and knows what to do when they leave your office.
In section 423, there's a couple things to be aware of regarding continued stay reviews. This is essentially the documentation to justify that a client continues at the current level of care or whether he or she should be moved to a different level of care. These recommendations are based on the ASAM criteria, and the frequency they need to be done is different for each level of treatment. So in level 1, we need to do one at least every 60 days or 10 hours of treatment services. In level 2, we need to do one at least every 30 days or 27 hours of treatment services, whichever is less. In level 3, we have to do one every 2 weeks, every 14 days. And in level 4, we need to do one every 24 hours. We also complete a continued stay review if there's a change in level of care and prior to discharge. Moving to section 427, we're looking at recovery planning and discharge planning. So what you want to know is that regardless of how a client is discharged, no matter what the discharge code is, that client needs to have a continued care plan. So this includes all the referrals and recommendations following treatment, any follow-up appointments that the client has, and whatever other continuum of care kinds of issues, whether it's going to outpatient counseling after they've already been in inpatient treatment, whether it's seeing a doctor, meeting with a counselor, attending any type of aftercare groups, self-help groups, whatever is going to go on with that person once they leave your program. And then in subpart E, this is its own section of the 2060. It's titled Intervention Licenses. Kind of interesting, it applies to both DUI providers and to recovery homes. So they have guidelines for both of those treatment services within subpart E. There's quite a bit of detail about DUI evaluation, so you should look at that. And if you are working in a DUI licensed agency, you'll want to be familiar with those requirements. It explains what goes into the DUI evaluation process, and then it also establishes 4 different levels of risk based on that DUI evaluation. So the lowest level is called minimal risk. At that level, you are required to get 10 hours of risk education in order to complete that. If you're assessed as moderate risk, then you need to complete that risk education, and then in addition to that, an extra 12 hours of treatment services. So the 10 hours of risk ed plus another 12 hours. If you're assessed significant risk, then you complete the risk education and an additional 20 hours of services. And finally, if you're high risk, then you complete 75 total hours of treatment. So this was just a brief look at some of the key parts of the Illinois Part 2060. There's much more detail if you want to look at that. You can easily find that online and take a look at some more of the sections and what's required for administration of different types of treatment programs. But it should give you a good idea of what those expectations are and what needs to happen at the various levels of treatment. And I think that gives you a big advantage when you're going into the field, understanding how the programs function.